Thank you for inviting us for this project. We are members of Decolonize This Place. I'm Natasha, this is Amin, there's Mars, and there's Amy. And we're excited about this conversation.
I mean, the first thing that comes to mind about commenting and heritage in terms of our practice is that, we come together because we're trying to create a we, and we work with others to recognize a we that's in formation and process. This relates to what Mars had mentioned about Fanon, or even in films and literature in the Palestinian context, which is, the human is a project, and it's one in which if you recognize it and do it with each other, then we're building the subjectivity that's necessary for the kind of worlds we want to see. I think our collective operates on a person to person level to practice that, to enact it, to think about it, but also to promulgate it and to find others who are thinking similarly. And that's where the traditions of decolonization and abolition come from. They're not about decolonization in terms of the 60s, 50s, 70s, where it's about the nation state and a government. It's about how can we be in relation to the land that is and not capitalist, that is not about objects, that is not about that. Now, it takes manifestation materially in the world by maybe being in contrast to institutions, but also pushing against them, thinking about power not hierarchically but with each other. Those are some of the things that our practice and our collective engages in.
The other thing about our collective is that when we started, we organized around 6 strands of struggle, and that was in 2016, which was Indigenous sovereignty, Black liberation, Free Palestine, global wage workers, degentrification, and dismantling patriarchy. And to a lot, it might sound like a laundry list of all the different struggles that exist on this planet, but actually its basis was this idea of commoning, right? Because what colonization also does is separate each one of us and refuses for us to have a conversation with each other. Because that's a tool of colonization, is to use language and other methods to say, well, you know what, you were colonized in a different way, so your issues of getting free are separate from issues of getting free elsewhere, right? And I think one of the things that we've done with our collective is build this common ground to understand that yes, we each one of us have a specificity of a struggle, but none of us are free until each one of us are free, right? So our collective, like our freedom is collective. And so that's something that's been kind of really important because it plays out in really different ways. Like, for example, in the context of Palestine, let's say in the South Asian context, people are very Islamophobic. So there's the work of making people understand that what's happening in Palestine is also the future of so many other places. For example, now what we're seeing with like changing of names like Gulf of Mexico to Gulf of America is colonialism 101, right? So Palestine is also in Mexico. Palestine is also in New York when you look at the policing strategies of what police departments do to people, right? And but when you look at it from the, let's say American context and like the movement for Black lives, which has completely gotten co-opted by the state, they're like, well, anti-Blackness is so deep that the entire world is anti-Black. And that actually produces another level of a hurdle that we see in terms of us coming together. And that's also been actually a struggle specifically in terms of Palestine solidarity work. We've seen that happen very quickly with the defeat of Kamala Harris, right? It became a very quick situation like, well, we're not going to deal with it because Palestine's the reason that the Democrats lost. It is a different math of understanding the world, right? So I think what we are trying to say is that we have to de-assimilate from this kind of logic of even organizing in our worlds. So commoning for us is, I think, is a good starting point. But if it's not connected to defense of land, water, air. And if it's not connected to understanding this planetary condition, which is outside of the nation state failure, it will reproduce the same narratives and the same problems of kind of going in the circle. So for us, I think the idea of coming together is also to understand that we are facing similar problems and our responses are different, but we have to be together. And the other thing that I think that is really important for us to think about is how do we build south to south solidarities, and how our questions of freedom are not really mediated by the West, right? And by that we don't mean just like geographical West, but also West as an ideology, because at this point the West is in the global South and the global South is also in the West. So it's not such a binary and there isn't purity. So these are some of the things I think that we're trying to build in terms of making sure that we connect with each other and are not working in issue silos.
Yeah, I'll just add a bit, which is that when I think of the commons, I think that it's based, as what was already said, in relationships to each other, to the land, to the water, to the air that we breathe. So relationships come first in the commons, and everything else will follow, right? So including heritage. Heritage is relational, and it's based not only in this idea of like memory and what we can preserve, but also the lessons that we learn that are very much so applicable today. And I think that the sharing of that knowledge and the sharing of stories through relationships is incredibly important when it comes to heritage, when it comes to the commons. And lastly, I would just say that in terms of the commons, I think people often think of like, what resources do we need and how do we pull them in common? Whereas I more so think of it as, what relationships do we need, and how do we bring those in common? And so when it comes to heritage, it's not necessarily, oh, let's make sure we get whatever a full universal picture is, because that's impossible. But rather, let's collect pieces to this puzzle in a way that gives us beautiful pictures no matter which way the pieces are aligned. And that's kind of how I think of the commons and heritage.